Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mobile, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1844, the port city of Mobile stood as Alabama's gateway to the Gulf of Mexico, its cobblestone streets echoing with the sounds of commerce and human bondage. Among the grand mansions that lined Government Street, the Whitmore estate rose like a monument to Southern prosperity, its white columns casting long shadows across manicured gardens, where Spanish moss draped from ancient live oaks like funeral shrouds. The official records of Mobile County list Clara as property acquired by plantation owner Jeremiah Whitmore in 1838, purchased from a Charleston auction house for the considerable sum of $800. What made Clara's price so remarkably high was noted in the bill of sale, preserved in the Mobile County Courthouse archives until 1962, when many documents were relocated during renovations and subsequently misfiled. The description listed her as being of mixed heritage, approximately 19 years of age, with what the auctioneer termed exceptional beauty and bearing suitable for household management. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. Jeremiah Whitmore was 43 years old when Clara arrived at his estate, a widower whose first wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth 2 years prior. The death had left him with no heir and a household staff he considered inadequate for maintaining his social standing among Mobile's planter elite. His neighbors later recalled that Jeremiah had spoken frequently of needing someone capable of managing the domestic affairs of his 12-room mansion, someone who could oversee the other house servants and ensure that his frequent dinner parties proceeded without embarrassment. What the neighbors did not discuss, at least not openly, were the whispered observations about how quickly Clara assumed responsibilities that extended far beyond typical household management. Within 6 months of her arrival, she was seen directing not only the kitchen staff, but also making decisions about which merchants the household would patronize and how the front parlors should be arranged for entertaining. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who lived in the adjacent mansion, noted in a letter to her sister in Charleston that Clara carried herself with an unusual dignity that made visitors sometimes mistake her position in the household. The transformation of Clara's status became more apparent in 1840 when church records show that Jeremiah Whitmore made a substantial donation to St. Francis Street Methodist Church, specifically requesting prayers for the blessing of children in his household. Reverend Samuel Morrison, whose personal journal was discovered in 1956 during the demolition of the old parsonage, wrote that Mr. Whitmore had visited him privately to discuss what he called matters of Christian conscience regarding family arrangements. By 1841, it was impossible for even the most diplomatically inclined neighbors to ignore that Clara was pregnant. The pregnancy caused considerable social tension among Mobile's established families, who found themselves in the awkward position of either acknowledging Clara's elevated status or risk offending one of the city's wealthiest men. Mrs. Hastings wrote again to her sister, this time noting that Clara had begun wearing dresses made of fine fabrics rather than the rough cotton typically provided to house servants, and that she had been seen wearing a cameo brooch that had previously belonged to the late Mrs. Whitmore. The birth of Clara's first child, a son named Thomas, was recorded in Jeremiah's personal papers, though not in any official capacity. The midwife who attended the birth, a free woman of color named Susanna Price, later told her granddaughter that the delivery took place in the master bedroom of the Whitmore house, rather than in the servants' quarters. Susanna's account, preserved in an oral history collected by a Works Progress Administration interviewer in 1937, described the birth as difficult but successful, with both mother and child appearing healthy. Thomas lived for exactly 7 months. The cause of death was listed in Jeremiah's private records as fever, though no physician was called to examine the child. Susanna Price later recalled that she had been summoned to the house but arrived to find the infant already deceased. His small body laid out in what she described as an unnaturally rigid position. When she inquired about preparing the body for burial, Jeremiah instructed her to wrap the child in a white sheet and place him in a small wooden box that had been hastily constructed by the estate's carpenter. The burial took place at dawn in a far corner of the Whitmore property, near where the formal gardens gave way to a grove of cedar trees. No marker was placed on the grave, and no record was made in the family Bible. Mrs. Hastings observed the burial from her upstairs window and noted that only Jeremiah, Clara, and 2 field hands were present. She wrote that Clara stood completely motionless throughout the brief ceremony, her face described as empty of all expression, as if she had withdrawn to some place where grief could not reach her. Within 3 months, Clara was pregnant again. This second pregnancy proceeded much like the first, with Clara continuing to manage the household while her condition became increasingly evident. The social dynamics had shifted somewhat, however, as several of Mobile's more prominent families began declining invitations to dine at the Whitmore estate. Judge Harrison McLaney, whose correspondence was donated to the Mobile Historical Society in 1949, wrote to a colleague in Montgomery that the situation at the Whitmore house had become untenable for respectable society, and though he stopped short of severing business relationships with Jeremiah entirely. Clara's second child, a daughter named Mary, was born in the spring of 1842. Like her brother, she was delivered in the master bedroom with Susanna Price attending. Susanna's granddaughter later recalled that the midwife had expressed private concerns about the health of the infant, noting that Mary seemed smaller and more fragile than expected, but had no specific symptoms that would indicate immediate danger. Mary lived for 11 months, longer than her brother, but her death followed a similar pattern. One morning, in February of 1843, Clara was found in the nursery, holding the child's lifeless body. Again, no physician was summoned, and the cause of death was recorded only in Jeremiah's private papers as natural causes. The burial followed the same ritual as Thomas's, taking place at dawn in the cedar grove, with no marker placed on the grave. The pattern of pregnancy, birth, and death continued with devastating regularity. Clara gave birth to 6 children between 1841 and 1846. Each child lived for periods ranging from 4 months to just over a year. Each death was attributed to common childhood ailments in Jeremiah's records: fever, difficulty breathing, or what was simply described as failure to thrive. Each burial followed the identical ceremony in the cedar grove. Dr. Ambrose Fletcher, who served as Mobile's health inspector during this period, became aware of the unusual pattern of infant deaths at the Whitmore estate through unofficial channels. His medical journal, discovered in 1964 when his former residence was being demolished, contains several entries expressing concern about the repeated deaths. However, Dr. Fletcher's notes also reveal the complex social constraints he faced in investigating the situation. As he wrote in 1845, "The circumstances at the Whitmore house warrant medical examination, yet the children in question hold no legal status that would permit official intervention, and the household's master exercises absolute authority over such matters." The servants who worked in the Whitmore house during this period maintained careful silence about what they observed. This silence was not uncommon, as house slaves understood that their safety depended entirely on their discretion regarding their master's private affairs. However, after the Civil War ended and many former slaves left the area, some accounts began to emerge through the testimonies collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents. Rachel Washington, who had worked as a cook in the Whitmore kitchen, told a Bureau interviewer in 1867 that the house had always felt heavy with watching. She described how Clara would spend hours each day in the nursery, even when no child was present, sometimes talking quietly to empty cradles. Rachel recalled that Clara's voice during these one-sided conversations was so low that the words could never be made out, but that the tone carried a quality she described as like someone pleading with ghosts. Joshua Coleman, who had worked as Jeremiah's personal valet, provided a more detailed account to Bureau agents. He described Jeremiah's behavior during the periods when Clara's children were dying as increasingly erratic. Joshua recalled being instructed to prepare travel arrangements for Jeremiah to leave Mobile for weeks at a time, only to have those plans cancelled at the last moment. During the final weeks of each child's life, Joshua observed that Jeremiah would spend entire nights in his study, often writing letters that were never sent and burning papers in the fireplace regardless of the season. The most detailed testimony came from Susanna Price, the midwife who had attended all of Clara's deliveries. By 1868, when she was interviewed, Susanna was nearly 70 years old and had delivered hundreds of children during her career. She told Bureau agents that Clara's pregnancies and deliveries had been normal in every medical respect. The children were born healthy, with no signs of the conditions that would later claim their lives. Susanna's account included disturbing details about the household atmosphere during each child's final weeks. She described being called to the house repeatedly to examine children who showed no obvious symptoms of illness, but whose mothers reported that they had become unusually quiet and lethargic. Susanna noted that these calls always came from Clara rather than from Jeremiah, and that Clara's requests for medical attention became increasingly desperate as each child grew weaker. Most significantly, Susanna recalled that she had never been present during any of the children's deaths. Despite Clara's urgent requests for medical care in the days preceding each death, Susanna would arrive at the house to find that her services were no longer needed, and that Jeremiah had already made arrangements for burial. When she asked to examine the deceased children to determine the cause of death, she was told that this would not be necessary. The transformation in Clara herself became increasingly apparent to those who observed her during these years. Mrs. Hastings continued her correspondence with her sister, documenting changes in Clara's appearance and behavior that troubled the neighboring household. By 1845, Clara was described as having lost considerable weight and developing what Mrs. Hastings called a hollow look around the eyes that made her seem much older than her years. More concerning to the neighbors were reports of Clara's behavior during the periods between pregnancies. She was observed walking through the formal gardens at unusual hours, particularly near dawn and dusk, often carrying items that appeared to be children's clothing or small toys. The estate's groundskeeper, a free man named Benjamin Carter, who lived on the property until 1847, later told his children that Clara would sometimes be found standing among the cedar trees where her children were buried, though she never displayed any outward signs of grief during these visits. The social isolation of the Whitmore household became complete by 1846. Judge McClaney's correspondence indicates that business relationships with Jeremiah had become strained, not due to moral concerns about his domestic arrangements, but because his behavior during business meetings had become unreliable. McClaney wrote that Jeremiah would sometimes arrive at appointments appearing not to have slept for days, and that he had developed a habit of ending conversations abruptly if certain topics were mentioned. The final pregnancy began in late 1846, and this time Clara's condition seemed to affect her more severely than previous pregnancies. Rachel Washington recalled that Clara had difficulty managing her household duties and often appeared confused about tasks that she had previously handled efficiently. More troubling were reports from other servants that Clara had begun talking to herself, though the content of these conversations was never clear to those who overheard them. The last child, a son named William, was born in March of 1847. Susanna Price's account of this delivery differed from her descriptions of the previous births. She noted that Clara appeared exhausted throughout the labor and that the delivery was more difficult than expected. The child was healthy, but Susanna observed that Clara's reaction to seeing her newborn son was markedly different from her previous responses to childbirth. Rather than the quiet joy and determination that had characterized her behavior with earlier children, Clara seemed almost reluctant to hold William. Susanna recalled that when the infant was placed in Clara's arms, she looked at him with what could only be described as terror. When asked if she needed assistance with nursing, Clara requested that another woman be found to serve as a wet nurse, claiming that she was too weak to care for the child properly. William lived for 13 months, longer than any of his siblings, but his death in April of 1848 marked the end of more than just another young life. Within days of the child's burial in the Cedar Grove, Clara disappeared from the Whitmore estate entirely. The circumstances of Clara's disappearance were never officially investigated. Jeremiah reported to anyone who inquired that he had sold Clara to a plantation owner in Mississippi, though no bill of sale was ever produced and no record of such a transaction exists in Mobile County files. Rachel Washington told bureau interviewers that Clara had simply been absent from the house one morning, and that Jeremiah had instructed the remaining servants never to speak her name again. Joshua Coleman provided a different account of Clara's final days at the estate. He recalled being instructed to prepare a traveling bag for Clara and to ensure that the carriage was ready for an early morning departure. However, Joshua noted that the bag contained far more items than would be typical for a slave being sold to another owner. Among the items he was told to pack were several pieces of jewelry that had belonged to the late Mrs. Whitmore, as well as a substantial amount of money in gold coins. Most significantly, Joshua observed Clara's final night in the house. He reported that she spent hours in the Cedar Grove, where her children were buried, and that when she returned to the house, she was carrying a small cloth bag that appeared to contain soil from the burial site. Joshua never learned what became of this bag, but he noted that Clara kept it with her throughout her preparations for departure. The transformation of the Whitmore estate following Clara's disappearance was dramatic and immediate. Jeremiah dismissed most of the house servants and stopped entertaining guests entirely. The formal gardens were allowed to overgrow, and the Cedar Grove, where Clara's children had been buried, became impenetrable due to neglect. Mrs. Hastings noted that lights were rarely seen in the windows of the house, and that Jeremiah could sometimes be observed walking the grounds alone late at night. By 1850, Jeremiah's business affairs had deteriorated to the point where he was forced to sell significant portions of his property to meet his debts. The mansion itself was sold in 1852 to a Mobile merchant family who reported that the house required extensive repairs due to years of neglect. The new owners also reported finding several disturbing items in the house that suggested the previous occupant had been living in conditions far below what would be expected of someone of his social standing. Among these items were stacks of unopened letters from business associates, furniture that had been pushed against windows to block natural light, and a series of journals written in Jeremiah's hand that contained what the new owners described as rambling entries about responsibility and judgment that made little coherent sense. These journals were reportedly destroyed by the new owners, who considered them too disturbing to preserve. The cedar grove where Clara's children had been buried presented a particular challenge for the new property owners. When they attempted to clear the area for new landscaping, workers reported finding multiple small wooden boxes buried in shallow graves throughout the grove. The contents of these boxes were never officially documented, but local records suggest that the new owners quietly arranged for their removal and reburial in Mobile's Magnolia Cemetery without markers or official documentation. Jeremiah Whitmore died in 1854 in New Orleans, where he had been living in a boarding house under circumstances that suggested significant financial hardship. His death was recorded in the New Orleans death records, but no family members claimed his body, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in the city's Potter's Field. The Mobile newspapers made no mention of his death, and by that time, most residents of the city had either forgotten or chosen not to remember the circumstances that had led to his departure. The fate of Clara remained unknown for more than a decade after her disappearance from the Whitmore estate. However, in 1863, a woman matching her description appeared in records kept by Union Army chaplains who were documenting the stories of freed slaves who had sought refuge in Union-controlled territories along the Mississippi River. According to these records, a woman named Clara had approached a Union encampment near Natchez, Mississippi, claiming to be a fugitive slave from Alabama. The chaplain who interviewed her, Reverend Marcus Webb, noted in his journal that the woman appeared to be in her early 40s and carried herself with unusual dignity despite obvious signs of hardship. More remarkably, Reverend Webb recorded that Clara had with her a small cloth bag that she claimed contained soil from the graves of her children. Clara's story, as recorded by Reverend Webb, differed significantly from what might have been expected from a typical fugitive slave narrative. Rather than describing escape from brutal conditions, Clara spoke of leaving a situation where she had held considerable authority and lived in relative comfort. She told the chaplain that her decision to flee had been motivated not by physical abuse, but by what she described as the weight of loss that had become too great to bear in that place. Most significantly, Clara revealed to Reverend Webb that she had not been sold to another plantation, as Jeremiah had claimed, but had been given her freedom, along with sufficient money to travel wherever she chose. According to Clara's account, Jeremiah had provided her with manumission papers and a considerable sum of money, telling her that her continued presence at the estate had become impossible for both of their souls. The manumission papers that Clara carried were examined by Union officials and found to be legally valid, dated May of 1848, just weeks after the death of her final child. The papers were signed by Jeremiah Whitmore and properly witnessed, indicating that Clara had been legally free for more than 15 years before presenting herself to Union authorities. Clara's reasons for concealing her free status for so long became clearer through her conversations with Reverend Webb and other Union officials. She explained that she had spent the years since leaving Mobile, traveling throughout Mississippi and Louisiana, supporting herself through domestic work, while searching for information about other children born to enslaved women who had died under similar circumstances. Clara had developed a theory that the deaths of her 6 children were not the result of natural causes or even deliberate harm, but were connected to a practice that she had gradually become aware of during her years of freedom. Through conversations with other women who had been enslaved, Clara had learned of cases where enslaved mothers who had been elevated to privileged positions within white households had experienced similar patterns of child deaths. The practice, as Clara described it to Union officials, involved the deliberate prevention of slave children from reaching maturity in cases where their parentage might complicate inheritance or social standing issues. Clara believed that her children had been systematically poisoned, using methods that would appear to be natural childhood illnesses, particularly during the critical period when their continued existence might have begun to affect their father's ability to remarry or produce legitimate heirs. Clara's accusations were based on her observation of several disturbing patterns during her time at the Whitmore estate. She noted that her children's deaths had always occurred during periods when Jeremiah was receiving social pressure from other members of Mobile's planter class regarding his domestic arrangements. More significantly, she had observed that Jeremiah's behavior toward each child had changed dramatically during their final weeks of life, shifting from apparent affection to what she described as a kind of terrible sadness that seemed to come over him whenever he looked at them. Most damning was Clara's account of finding, hidden in Jeremiah's study, correspondence with Dr. Marcus Thornfield, a physician who had served several prominent Mobile families but had left the city abruptly in 1847. Clara claimed that these letters, which she had discovered while cleaning Jeremiah's study, contained discussions of methods for managing situations that compromise social standing and references to solutions that appear natural but achieve necessary outcomes. Clara had been unable to take these letters with her when she left the estate, but she provided detailed enough descriptions to Union investigators that they were able to locate Dr. Thornfield in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he had established a new practice. When questioned by Union authorities in 1864, Dr. Thornfield initially denied any knowledge of unusual circumstances surrounding child deaths in Mobile. However, when confronted with Clara's specific allegations, he admitted to providing Jeremiah Whitmore with what he called guidance regarding difficult domestic situations. Dr. Thornfield's confession, recorded in Union Army investigative files that were transferred to civilian authorities after the war, revealed the systematic nature of the crimes that had taken place at the Whitmore estate. According to Dr. Thornfield, Jeremiah had approached him in 1842, shortly after the death of Clara's first child, seeking medical advice about preventing future complications that might arise from unauthorized family arrangements. Dr. Thornfield had provided Jeremiah with a collection of pharmaceutical substances that would produce symptoms resembling common childhood illnesses, but would be undetectable to any physician who might be called to examine the children. The substances were derived from plants common in southern gardens, including foxglove and oleander, and were designed to be administered gradually over periods of weeks to avoid suspicion. The systematic poisoning of Clara's children had been carried out by Jeremiah himself, according to Dr. Thornfield's confession. The physician provided detailed instructions for administering the substances through milk or soft foods that would appeal to young children. The timing of each child's death had been carefully planned to occur during periods when Clara would be most emotionally vulnerable and least likely to question the cause or demand medical examination. Dr. Thornfield's revelation explained several aspects of the children's deaths that had troubled Susanna Price, the midwife who had attended Clara. The physician confirmed that the children had been born healthy and showed no signs of genetic or developmental problems that would account for their deaths. He also explained why Susanna had never been present during any of the deaths, as Jeremiah had specifically planned the final administration of the fatal doses to occur when no medical witnesses would be available. The investigation into Dr. Thornfield's activities revealed that the practice of systematically eliminating children born to enslaved women was more widespread than initially suspected. Union investigators found evidence that Dr. Thornfield had provided similar services to at least 3 other wealthy families in Mobile and surrounding areas, always under the guise of preventing social complications that might arise from the presence of mixed-race children who might eventually claim inheritance rights or social recognition. Clara's decision to cooperate with Union investigators was motivated by her desire to ensure that the men responsible for her children's deaths faced legal consequences. However, the practical challenges of pursuing justice for crimes committed against enslaved people proved insurmountable. Neither Jeremiah Whitmore nor Dr. Thornfield could be prosecuted under Alabama law for the deaths of children who had held no legal status at the time of their births. The Union authorities who documented Clara's testimony recognized the injustice of this legal situation, but were powerless to provide the criminal prosecution that Clara sought. Instead, they focused on ensuring that Dr. Thornfield's medical license was revoked and that information about his practices was shared with medical authorities throughout the region to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. Clara's story might have ended with this frustrated search for justice, but her cooperation with Union investigators led to an unexpected development that would provide a different kind of resolution. Among the Union officials who reviewed Clara's case was Captain James Morrison, the son of Reverend Samuel Morrison, who had served the Methodist Church in Mobile during the period when Clara's children were being born and dying. Captain Morrison recalled his father's private concerns about the situation at the Whitmore estate and his frustration at being unable to intervene in what he suspected was a deeply troubling situation. Reverend Morrison had died in 1861, but among his papers that were preserved by his family were detailed records of his attempts to find some legal or religious avenue for protecting Clara's children. These records revealed that Reverend Morrison had suspected the true cause of the children's deaths as early as 1843, when the pattern had become clear to anyone who was paying attention. The Reverend had attempted to approach both civil authorities and other religious leaders in Mobile about his concerns, but had been told repeatedly that the matter fell outside the jurisdiction of any institution that might provide protection for enslaved people. Most significantly, Reverend Morrison's papers included copies of letters he had written to abolition societies in the North, describing the situation at the Whitmore estate and requesting advice about possible interventions. These letters had received sympathetic responses, but no practical assistance, as the legal and social systems that protected slavery made any intervention impossible from outside Alabama. Captain Morrison shared his father's papers with Clara, providing her with the first evidence that someone in Mobile had recognized the crimes being committed against her children and had attempted, however unsuccessfully, to stop them. The knowledge that a witness had tried to help her, even when such help was legally impossible, provided Clara with a measure of comfort that legal prosecution had been unable to offer. Clara spent the remaining years of the Civil War working with Union forces to document similar cases of crimes committed against enslaved families throughout the South. Her detailed knowledge of the social dynamics that had enabled the systematic murder of her children made her a valuable resource for investigators who were attempting to understand the full scope of slavery's brutality. After the war ended, Clara remained in Mississippi, where she established a small school for formerly enslaved children in a rural community near Natchez. The school operated for more than 20 years, serving families who had been scattered by the disruptions of war and emancipation. Clara's students later recalled that she was a demanding but compassionate teacher, who insisted on academic excellence while providing emotional support for children who had experienced trauma. Clara never married or had additional children, but she maintained correspondence with several of the families she had met during her work with Union investigators. Her letters, preserved by recipients and later donated to historical societies, reveal that she continued to research cases of unexplained child deaths in slaveholding families throughout the post-war period, documenting patterns of behavior that suggested systematic elimination of children whose existence threatened white family stability. In 1873, Clara made her final trip to Mobile. The city had changed dramatically during Reconstruction, with many of the grand mansions along Government Street serving as boarding houses or commercial establishments. The Whitmore estate had been subdivided and sold to developers, with the original mansion demolished to make way for smaller residences. Clara's visit to the site of her former home was documented by a mobile newspaper reporter who interviewed her about her experiences during slavery. The resulting article, published in the Mobile Daily Tribune, provided one of the few contemporary accounts of Clara's story that acknowledged both her elevated status within the Whitmore household and the tragic fate of her children. The newspaper account described Clara as a woman of remarkable dignity and intelligence who had endured losses that would have destroyed a lesser spirit. The reporter noted that Clara spent several hours at the site where the cedar grove had once stood, and that she had brought with her a small cloth bag that she emptied onto the ground where her children had been buried. The contents of the bag, according to the newspaper account, were soil samples that Clara had collected from the communities where she had worked since leaving Mobile. She explained to the reporter that she had carried these soil samples as a reminder of the life she had built after leaving Alabama, and that she had chosen to leave them at the site of her children's graves as a symbol of the growth that could emerge from even the most devastating loss. Clara's final years were spent in Natchez, where she died in 1889 at the approximate age of 70. Her death was noted in local newspapers, which described her as a beloved teacher and community leader who had dedicated her life to education and social justice. The newspapers made no mention of her earlier life in Mobile or the circumstances that had brought her to Mississippi. The school that Clara had established continued to operate under the leadership of her former students until the early 1900s, when changes in public education funding made private schools for African American children financially unsustainable. The building that had housed Clara's school was eventually converted to other uses, but a small marker was placed on the property in 1937 by community members who wanted to preserve the memory of Clara's educational work. The marker made no mention of Clara's children or the circumstances that had led to her arrival in Mississippi. Instead, it simply identified her as an educator who had dedicated her life to helping others overcome the legacy of slavery through learning and community support. The understated memorial reflected Clara's own wishes, expressed in her final letters, that she be remembered for what she had built rather than for what had been taken from her. The documentation of Clara's story in Union Army records and post-war newspaper accounts provided historians with one of the most detailed examples of the complex relationships that existed between enslaved women and their masters, particularly in cases where emotional and sexual relationships developed within the context of legal ownership. Clara's experience illustrated both the privileges that could be granted to enslaved people in certain circumstances and the ultimate powerlessness that defined all relationships between slaves and masters. More significantly, Clara's testimony provided crucial evidence for understanding the systematic nature of violence against enslaved families, particularly violence that was designed to eliminate evidence of sexual relationships between white men and enslaved women. The murder of Clara's children represented not random cruelty, but calculated efforts to maintain social and economic systems that depended on denying the humanity and family relationships of enslaved people. The investigation into Dr. Thornfield's activities also revealed the extent to which medical professionals in the antebellum South had been complicit in maintaining slavery through practices that went far beyond simply treating injured slaves as property. Dr. Thornfield's willingness to provide methods for systematically murdering children demonstrated how professional medical knowledge had been perverted to serve the economic and social interests of slaveholders. The broader implications of Clara's story extended beyond the specific crimes committed against her family to illuminate the psychological and emotional costs of slavery for both enslaved people and slaveholders. Jeremiah Whitmore's mental deterioration following the deaths of Clara's children suggested that even those who benefited economically from slavery were not immune to the moral and emotional consequences of participating in such a brutal system. Clara's ability to survive the loss of 6 children and build a meaningful life dedicated to helping others demonstrated the extraordinary resilience that enabled many formerly enslaved people to overcome seemingly insurmountable trauma. Her work as an educator and investigator showed how individual experiences of violence under slavery could be transformed into broader efforts to understand and prevent similar crimes. The preservation of Clara's story in historical records also illustrated the importance of documentation efforts undertaken by Union investigators and post-war journalists who recognized that the experiences of enslaved people represented crucial evidence about the true nature of slavery. Without these systematic efforts to record testimonies like Clara's, much of the detailed knowledge about slavery's impact on families and communities would have been lost. The geographic scope of Clara's investigations into similar cases throughout the South suggested that the systematic murder of children born to enslaved women was not an isolated phenomenon limited to the Whitmore estate. Clara's documentation of similar patterns in other communities provided evidence that such crimes were part of a broader strategy used by slave-holding families to manage the social and economic complications that arose from sexual relationships between white men and enslaved women. The medical aspects of Clara's case also contributed to understanding how scientific knowledge was weaponized to maintain slavery. Dr. Thornfield's use of plant-based poisons that would mimic natural childhood diseases demonstrated the sophisticated methods that were employed to commit crimes against enslaved people while avoiding detection or legal consequences. Clara's decision to dedicate her post-war life to education reflected a common pattern among formerly enslaved people who recognized that learning and literacy were essential tools for building communities and protecting future generations from exploitation. Her school in Mississippi served not only the immediate educational needs of local children, but also as a model for how education could serve as a form of resistance to ongoing racial oppression. The eventual demolition of the Whitmore estate and the development of the property for other uses reflected the broader transformation of Southern cities during Reconstruction and the decades that followed. The physical erasure of the sites where slavery's crimes had been committed paralleled efforts to minimize or ignore the historical significance of such places in shaping American society. Clara's final visit to Mobile and her ritual of leaving soil from other communities at the site of her children's graves provided a powerful example of how formerly enslaved people created their own forms of commemoration and healing in the absence of official recognition or justice. Her personal ceremony acknowledged both the reality of her loss and the life she had created despite that loss. The preservation of Clara's story through multiple sources, including Union Army records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories collected decades later, demonstrated the importance of using diverse forms of documentation to reconstruct the experiences of people whose lives had been systematically excluded from official historical records. Each source provided different perspectives on Clara's experience while contributing to a more complete understanding of her story. The investigation into Dr. Thornfield's practices also revealed the networks of complicity that enabled slavery's violence to continue unchallenged for so long. The physician's ability to provide murder methods to multiple slave-holding families without facing legal or professional consequences illustrated how entire social and economic systems had been organized to protect white interests while denying basic protections to enslaved people. Clara's testimony about her elevated status within the Whitmore household provided important evidence about the complex hierarchies that existed among enslaved people and the ways in which relative privilege could be used to manipulate and control enslaved communities. Her experience showed how even enslaved people who achieved positions of authority and comfort remained fundamentally vulnerable to their masters' arbitrary decisions about their lives and families. The psychological impact of Clara's losses, as documented in the testimonies of people who knew her both during and after slavery, illustrated the long-term effects of trauma on individuals and communities. Clara's ability to channel her grief into productive work, helping others, demonstrated both the strength of individual resilience and the importance of community support in healing from systematic violence. The legal limitations that prevented prosecution of Jeremiah Whitmore and Dr. Thornfield highlighted the inadequacy of existing legal systems for addressing crimes committed against enslaved people. Clara's frustration with the lack of criminal justice in her case reflected the broader challenges that formerly enslaved people faced in seeking accountability for crimes committed under slavery. The documentation of Clara's story also provided evidence about the role that religious institutions played in both enabling and attempting to resist slavery's violence. Reverend Morrison's unsuccessful attempts to intervene on behalf of Clara's children illustrated both the moral recognition of slavery's crimes by some religious leaders and the institutional limitations that prevented effective action. Clara's work with Union investigators during the Civil War demonstrated how the disruption of slavery created opportunities for formerly enslaved people to share their experiences and contribute to efforts to understand and document slavery's impact. Her detailed knowledge and analytical skills made her a valuable resource for officials who were attempting to comprehend the full scope of slavery's systematic violence. The transformation of the Whitmore estate following Clara's departure and Jeremiah's eventual death illustrated how the economic and social systems that had supported slavery began to collapse even before the Civil War formally ended the institution. The deterioration of the property and Jeremiah's financial and mental decline showed how slavery's violence ultimately consumed even those who had appeared to benefit from the system. Clara's establishment of a school in Mississippi represented a common pattern among formerly enslaved people who recognized education as both a practical necessity for survival in freedom and a form of resistance to ongoing efforts to maintain racial subordination. Her success as an educator demonstrated how skills developed during slavery could be transformed into tools for community building and empowerment. The long-term impact of Clara's educational work extended far beyond the immediate community she served in Mississippi. Several of her former students went on to establish schools in other parts of the state, creating a network of educational institutions that served African American communities throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These schools maintained Clara's emphasis on academic excellence, combined with practical skills that would enable students to support themselves and their families in an increasingly hostile social environment. Among Clara's most successful students was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived at Clara's school as an 8-year-old orphan in 1867. Sarah later credited Clara with not only providing her with an education, but also serving as a model of how individual strength could emerge from devastating circumstances. Sarah went on to establish a teacher training institute in Jackson, Mississippi, that operated until 1923 and prepared more than 200 African American women to work as educators throughout the rural South. Sarah's correspondence with Clara preserved in the Mitchell family papers and donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 1958, provides insight into Clara's teaching methods and her philosophy about education's role in healing communities damaged by slavery and its aftermath. Sarah wrote that Clara emphasized the importance of understanding history not as a source of bitterness, but as a foundation for building better futures for subsequent generations. Clara's approach to discussing slavery with her students was particularly noteworthy, given her personal experiences. Rather than avoiding the topic or presenting it in abstract terms, Clara used her own story as a teaching tool, while carefully protecting her students from details that might be too disturbing for young minds to process. Sarah recalled that Clara would speak about the importance of family bonds and community support, while acknowledging that these relationships had often been disrupted or destroyed by slavery's violence. The influence of Clara's educational philosophy extended beyond formal schooling to encompass broader community development efforts. Several of her former students became leaders in establishing churches, mutual aid societies, and cooperative businesses that served African American communities throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. These institutions reflected Clara's belief that education should serve practical purposes in helping people build stable, self-sufficient communities. Clara's correspondence with other educators and community leaders throughout the South, preserved in various historical collections, reveals that she maintained extensive networks of communication with people working on similar projects. Her letters provided advice about curriculum development, teacher training, and strategies for maintaining schools despite limited financial resources and occasional hostility from white communities. The financial sustainability of Clara's school was maintained through a combination of tuition payments from families who could afford them, donations from northern philanthropic organizations, and income from a small farm that Clara operated on the school property. The farm served both as a source of food for the school and as a training ground, where students learned agricultural techniques that would enable them to support themselves as adults. Clara's management of the school's finances demonstrated the practical skills she had developed during her years managing the Whitmore household. Her detailed record-keeping and careful budgeting enabled the school to operate successfully even during periods when many similar institutions failed due to economic pressures or lack of administrative expertise. The curriculum at Clara's school reflected her understanding of the practical needs facing formerly enslaved people, while also emphasizing academic subjects that would prepare students for leadership roles in their communities. Students learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic science, but they also received instruction in practical skills such as farming, carpentry, sewing, and household management. Clara's insistence on academic rigor distinguished her school from many other educational institutions serving African American students during this period. She maintained high standards for student performance and regularly corresponded with educators in northern states to ensure that her curriculum remained current with educational developments in more established school systems. The reputation of Clara's school attracted students from throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. Families would sometimes travel hundreds of miles to enroll their children, and many students boarded at the school during the academic year. Clara's ability to provide safe, nurturing environment for children who had often experienced significant trauma made her school particularly valuable for families who were still struggling to rebuild their lives after emancipation. The boarding arrangements at Clara's school reflected her understanding of the importance of family-like relationships in helping children develop emotional stability. Rather than operating the school as an impersonal institution, Clara created an environment where students formed close relationships with both teachers and fellow students. Many former students later wrote that these relationships had been crucial in helping them overcome the effects of earlier trauma and develop confidence in their abilities. Clara's personal relationships with her students were characterized by warmth and individual attention, but also by clear expectations for behavior and academic performance. Former students recalled that Clara was demanding but never harsh, and that she had an exceptional ability to recognize each student's particular strengths and challenges. Her teaching methods emphasized encouragement and support rather than punishment or criticism. The medical care that Clara provided for her students reflected both her practical experience caring for children and her understanding of the limited health care available to African American families in rural Mississippi. Clara learned basic medical techniques from local physicians and midwives, and she maintained a supply of medicines and medical equipment that enabled her to treat common childhood illnesses and injuries. Clara's medical knowledge proved particularly valuable during several epidemics that affected the local community during the 1870s and 1880s. Her experience managing health crises at the school led to requests for assistance from other community leaders, and Clara often served as an informal healthcare provider for families throughout the surrounding area. The integration of healthcare and education in Clara's work reflected her holistic approach to community development. She understood that children could not learn effectively if they were ill or malnourished, and she worked to ensure that all aspects of her students' physical and emotional needs were addressed. This comprehensive approach to education became a model that was adopted by other schools established by her former students. Clara's relationships with white community members in Mississippi were complex and varied, depending on individual attitudes and economic interests. Some white residents viewed her school as a positive development that would provide trained workers for local businesses and farms. Others saw any education for African Americans as a threat to established social hierarchies and occasionally attempted to interfere with the school's operations. Clara's strategy for managing these relationships involved maintaining a low profile while ensuring that her school's positive impact on the community was visible to all residents. She emphasized the practical benefits of education for the entire community and avoided confrontational approaches that might have provoked hostile reactions from white residents who opposed African American advancement. The support that Clara received from Northern philanthropic organizations was crucial for the school's long-term success. Organizations such as the American Missionary Association provided both financial assistance and educational materials that enhanced the school's ability to serve students effectively. Clara's detailed reports to these organizations documented both the school's achievements and the ongoing challenges facing African American education in the South. Clara's correspondence with Northern supporters reveals her sophisticated understanding of the political and economic factors affecting African American communities during Reconstruction and its aftermath. Her letters provided detailed analyses of local conditions and specific recommendations for policies and programs that would support educational and economic development. The decline of Northern support for Southern education during the 1880s created significant challenges for Clara's school and similar institutions throughout the region. As political interest in Reconstruction waned and economic depression affected philanthropic giving, many schools were forced to reduce their operations or close entirely. Clara's ability to maintain her school during this difficult period reflected both her administrative skills and the strong community support she had built over decades of service. The transition from external support to community-based funding required Clara to develop new strategies for maintaining the school's operations. She worked with local business leaders and landowners to create apprenticeship programs that would provide income for the school while offering valuable training opportunities for students. These partnerships demonstrated Clara's ability to build bridges between different segments of the community while maintaining her commitment to educational excellence. Clara's health began to decline in the mid-1880s, creating concerns about the school's future leadership. Rather than simply naming a successor, Clara implemented a gradual transition process that involved training several of her most experienced former students to share administrative responsibilities. This collaborative approach ensured that the school's operations would continue smoothly, even as Clara reduced her direct involvement. The community's response to Clara's declining health demonstrated the deep respect and affection she had earned through decades of service. Families throughout the region contributed to a fund that enabled Clara to receive medical care while ensuring that the school's operations would not be disrupted. Former students who had moved to other parts of the country sent money and letters of support that provided both practical assistance and emotional encouragement. Clara's final years were marked by increasing recognition of her contributions to education and community development. Newspaper articles in both Mississippi and northern publications described her work and its impact on African American communities throughout the South. These articles helped to preserve Clara's story and ensure that her educational philosophy would continue to influence later generations of educators. The memorial service held for Clara following her death in 1889 brought together people from throughout Mississippi and neighboring states. The attendance included former students who had become teachers, preachers, and business leaders, as well as white community members who had come to respect Clara's work, despite initial skepticism about African American education. The eulogies delivered at Clara's memorial service emphasized both her personal strength in overcoming tragedy and her dedication to helping others build better lives for themselves and their families. Speakers noted that Clara had transformed her own experience of loss into a source of strength that had benefited hundreds of students and their communities. The preservation of Clara's school building as a memorial to her work reflected the community's determination to maintain her legacy. Although the school itself could no longer operate due to changes in public education funding, the building was maintained as a meeting place for community organizations and a symbol of the importance of education in African American advancement. The broader historical significance of Clara's story became more apparent as historians began to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people and their contributions to American society. Clara's detailed testimony about slavery's violence and her subsequent work as an educator provided crucial evidence about both the systematic nature of slavery's crimes and the remarkable resilience of those who survived the institution. The medical evidence that Clara helped to preserve regarding Dr. Thornfield's poisoning methods contributed to historical understanding of how professional knowledge was perverted to serve slavery's interests. This documentation proved valuable for later researchers studying the complicity of medical professionals in maintaining racial oppression and violence. Clara's investigative work documenting similar cases throughout the South created an important historical record that might otherwise have been lost. Her systematic approach to gathering testimony and evidence provided a model for later civil rights investigators and helped to establish patterns of violence that extended far beyond individual cases of cruelty. The educational institutions established by Clara and her students represented a crucial foundation for African American advancement during the post-Reconstruction period. These schools provided education and leadership training that enabled communities to maintain some degree of autonomy and self-determination, despite increasing legal and social restrictions on African American rights. The transformation of Clara's personal tragedy into a life dedicated to helping others illustrated the complex processes through which individuals and communities recovered from systematic violence and oppression. Clara's story demonstrated that healing from trauma could involve not only personal recovery, but also efforts to prevent similar harm to others and to build institutions that would protect future generations. The documentation of Clara's story through multiple sources over several decades provided historians with an unusually complete picture of one woman's experience of slavery, freedom, and community building. This detailed record offered insights into the broader patterns of African American life during the 19th century, while preserving the specific details of Clara's remarkable individual journey. Years after Clara's death, visitors to the site of the former Whitmore estate in Mobile would occasionally find small objects left near where the cedar grove had once stood. These items, which included children's toys, flowers, and handwritten notes, suggested that Clara's story had been preserved in local memory and continued to resonate with people who understood the significance of what had occurred there. The soil that Clara had brought from other communities and left at her children's burial site had mixed with the earth of Mobile, creating a symbolic connection between the place of her greatest loss and the communities where she had found purpose and healing. This physical memorial represented the ways in which individual experiences of trauma and recovery could become part of larger stories about resilience and transformation. The legacy of Clara's educational work extended far beyond the specific students she had taught to encompass broader questions about the role of education in social justice and community development. Her model of combining academic instruction with practical skills training and community building provided a template that influenced educational approaches throughout the South for generations. Clara's story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest periods of American history, individuals found ways to resist oppression and create meaning from suffering. Her transformation from a woman who lost 6 children to systematic murder into an educator who helped hundreds of other children build better lives demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of human beings to overcome even the most devastating circumstances and contribute to positive change in their communities. The silence that had protected the crimes committed against Clara's children was ultimately broken by Clara's own courage in speaking truth about her experiences. Her willingness to testify about painful events that many people would have preferred to forget or ignore helped to create a historical record that continues to inform understanding of slavery's impact and the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. In the end, Clara's story illustrates both the systematic nature of violence under slavery and the equally systematic efforts of formerly enslaved people to build institutions and communities that would protect and nurture future generations. Her life demonstrated that individual acts of resistance and community building could have effects that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances, creating legacies that would influence history long after the original actors had passed away. The cedar grove where Clara's children were buried no longer exists, and the grand mansions of Mobile's antebellum elite have given way to modern development. But the schools, churches, and communities that Clara and her students built throughout Mississippi continue to influence the region's social and educational landscape. In transforming her personal tragedy into a force for positive change, Clara created a legacy that proved more enduring than the physical monuments to wealth and power that once dominated the landscape of her early life.